fog clung to the ridgeline like something alive, slipping between the pines and dragging its cold fingers across the old cabin where Evelyn and Marlene Turner had lived their entire lives. The forest around them, dense, unbroken, and older than any map, held a silence that was never peaceful, only watching. Locals said the mountains remembered things long after people wished they wouldn't. The sisters had always dismissed those warnings as mountain superstition, the kind of talk old men whispered over moonshine to keep children from wandering after dark. But that was before the knocking began. It started as a single tap beneath their bedroom window, soft but intentional, like a fingertip pressed to glass. Then came another. And another. Slow, steady, deliberate. The kind of sound a person makes when they want you to know they're there but not what they want. When they opened the door the next morning, there were footprints in the mud, bare, enormous, and sunk deep as if something heavy had crouched right beside their walls, listening. By the third night, the knocking had become a rhythm. The pattern was too precise to be an animal, too patient to be a prank, and too confident to be human. The hunters who came down from the North Ridge told them a story, spoken quietly and with eyes that refused to meet theirs. A story about a man who wasn't raised by people, a man who learned the language of the woods instead of words, a man whose face no one had truly seen. Some swore he wasn't a man at all. Others swore he wanted something he always took from those who lived too close to the old gorge. The sisters laughed it off until the morning they found their goats arranged in a strange circle, untouched by scavengers, their bodies marked by shallow, symmetrical cuts. That same day, Evelyn collapsed without warning, Marlene soon after, both struck by an illness no doctor could name. But it was the night of the violent storm, the night lightning turned the sky white and the world shook, that carved fear into their bones for good. They awoke bruised, dazed, unable to recall the hours that had passed, with the cabin door wide open and muddy prints leading inside. Something had come for them. And whatever it was, it wasn't finished. The first signs crept into the sisters' lives so quietly that, at first, they barely acknowledged them. Their cabin sat alone at the far end of Briar Hollow, a place where the mountains folded in on themselves and swallowed sound, leaving every noise amplified in unsettling ways. Evelyn Turner had always sworn the woods carried echoes that didn't belong to anyone living, while Marlene teased her for being dramatic. But on that particular night, after the fire had burned low and the lantern's glow flickered against the log walls, both women felt the air shift. The silence outside grew too thick, too perfect, like the whole forest was holding its breath. It was in that unnatural stillness that the first knock came, a slow, measured tap against the wall beneath their bedroom window, so faint it could have been a pinecone dropping. They listened. Nothing followed. But the air didn't loosen after. It felt as though the woods themselves were waiting for a response. Minutes later, a second knock sounded. This one clearer, more deliberate, as if a fingertip pressed firmly against the logs. Marlene tried to rationalize it, muttering about branches swaying in the wind, but there was no wind. Not even a leaf shivered. Evelyn crept to the window, lifted the edge of the curtain, and peered out into the pitch-dark yard. She saw nothing, no figure, no shadow, not even the outline of a passing animal. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had moved just before she looked, slipping out of view in a way no human could. They tried to sleep, but sleep refused to come. Every creak of the cabin felt magnified, every distant snap of a twig in the woods sharp enough to jolt the nerves. When the third knock arrived, it wasn't at the window. It came from the far side of the house, near the corner where the ground dipped into a thicket the sisters avoided even in daylight. This knock carried an odd rhythm, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. It didn't resemble any animal behavior either of them knew, and it certainly wasn't the sound of shifting wood. It was intentional. Patterned. Almost like communication. By dawn, both women were exhausted, though neither admitted how deeply the sounds had unsettled them. When they stepped outside, the morning mist hovered low over the ground, and that was when they noticed the prints. They were barefoot impressions in the soft mud, wide, long, and pressed so deeply it was as if whatever made them carried an impossible weight. The prints circled the cabin in a slow, patient loop, as though something had stalked the perimeter for hours, tapping lightly each time it paused to listen to the breathing inside the walls. The hunters who passed through Briar Hollow each autumn were rough-edged men, weathered by the mountains in a way that made their warnings feel less like stories and more like unspoken rules. They had grown up learning which hollows to avoid, which ridgelines carried echoes that weren't their own, and which parts of the forest seemed to watch back. 4 years, these men came and went from the Turner sisters' cabin to trade meat or share news, but they had never seemed troubled by anything in the nearby woods until the season the knocking began. When the sisters mentioned the strange noises in a half-joking tone, expecting teasing or simple explanations, the hunters did not laugh. Instead, they fell silent, exchanging glances heavy with something that looked very much like dread. The oldest among them, a man with a scar across his cheek and hands that trembled ever so slightly, finally pulled the sisters aside and spoke in a low voice that carried no hint of exaggeration. He told them about the gorge 2 miles north, a place where the ground sloped violently downward into a maze of underbrush and stone outcroppings. According to him, no map showed what lay at the bottom, and anyone who tried to explore it always returned with the same shaken expression. Over the years, they had spotted a figure moving through that deep timber, a man, or something close enough to resemble one. Tall, gaunt, moving with an unnatural, animal-like fluidity that didn't match the gait of any human they had ever tracked. They described him as feral, born from a hidden line of people who had lived apart from the rest of the mountains for generations. Some said he was abandoned as a child and raised by the wilderness itself. Others whispered that he was a remnant of something older than the towns around him, a fragment of mountain folklore that had simply never died out. Whenever the hunters caught glimpses of him, it was only in flashes, a silhouette slipping between pines, a pale shape crouching near the rocks, a pair of eyes reflecting light in a way no animals ever did. The creature, if that was what he was, kept to the gorge, avoiding people unless they wandered too close. Those who did often returned speaking of rustling in the brush that matched their steps, of low, guttural breathing just beyond the tree line, and of the distinct sensation that something had been testing their reactions. The hunters warned the sisters never to wander alone and joked, half-heartedly, that the creature was harmless as long as no one drew his curiosity. But beneath their forced smiles, the sisters sensed a deeper truth. Whatever lived in the gorge was not simply a mountain legend, and the fear in the hunters' eyes suggested they believed the thing had finally taken interest in someone new. The morning after the hunters shared their warnings, the sisters stepped outside with a fresh heaviness in their chests, unsure whether they had been frightened by old mountain tales or by something far more real. The mist still clung to the ground in long, drifting ribbons, and the air carried that sharp, metallic cold that came before winter. Evelyn was the first to notice the disturbance in the dirt near the woodpile. At a glance, it looked like the usual mudded patches left by deer or stray dogs, but as she crouched down, her breath caught. These were not animal tracks. They were unmistakably human, yet wrong in ways that made her skin prickle. The footprints were huge, longer than any pair of boots she'd ever seen, and completely bare, each toe embedded clearly into the soil. The weight behind them must have been immense. The prints sank nearly 2 inches deep into the earth, as though whoever or whatever made them moved with both power and a strange, heavy stillness. Marlene tried to rationalize what they were seeing, muttering possibilities under her breath. But the prints continued around the cabin in a slow, looping circle, pausing at each window as though the creature had stopped to examine the cracks and seams of the structure. The sisters followed the trail, their nerves tightening with each step, noticing how the prints moved with deliberate intent. No stumbling, no wandering, just a calm, silent pacing, like a predator walking a boundary. When they reached the western wall of the cabin, Marlene's voice failed her. There, beneath the bedroom window where the first knocks had been heard, the footprints deepened dramatically, pressing into the mud with such force the soil had actually cracked at the edges. Something had crouched there for a long time, listening, watching, studying the faint glow of their lantern as they slept. What unsettled them most wasn't just the size or depth of the prints, but the shape. The arch was unnaturally high, almost distorted, and the toes splayed outward in a way no human foot naturally would. It was as if the bones inside had adapted to years of moving barefoot across brutal, uneven ground. Even stranger were the faint drag marks beside some of the steps, shallow grooves as though knuckles or fingertips had brushed the earth while the creature moved low to the ground, half crawling, half walking. The trail eventually disappeared into the thicket behind the cabin, swallowed by shadows too dense to see through even in daylight. By the time they finished tracing the tracks, the sisters no longer wondered if the hunter's warnings were folklore. Something had been out there, something that had circled their home with patience, curiosity, and a chilling awareness of their presence. The discovery of the footprints was disturbing enough, but what the sisters found the next morning forced a shift from unease to genuine fear. Evelyn stepped outside to feed the goats and froze before she even reached the pen. The animals weren't scattered or missing. Instead, they were lying in a perfect ring around the trough, each body placed with unsettling precision, as though arranged by an unseen hand following a pattern only it understood. None of the animals looked mauled in a typical predatory way. There were no torn limbs or teeth marks, nothing that suggested a wild animal had acted out of hunger. Instead, each goat bore shallow, deliberate cuts along the flank and neck, incisions so uniform they almost resembled markings carved with intention rather than violence. It was as if someone had studied their anatomy carefully before touching a blade to their skin. Marlene, breathless, knelt beside one of the animals and pressed her fingertips to the wounds. They weren't deep enough to cause excessive blood loss. Whoever or whatever had done this hadn't killed them for food. It felt like the cuts existed solely to leave a message, some kind of symbol carved not on stone but flesh. The more they examined the arrangement, the more they noticed how meticulously everything had been placed. Each goat's head pointed inward toward the center of the circle, and small stones had been scattered between them in a pattern that made no sense to the sisters but looked disturbingly familiar. It reminded Evelyn of something she had seen carved into the old Cherokee markers along the riverbed, simple geometric shapes arranged in ways that always implied warning or boundary. The sisters exchanged glances heavy with dread. They had lived in Briar Hollow their whole lives, knew its wildlife, its predators, its folklore. Nothing in these mountains behaved like this. Even the most cunning and vicious animals acted out of instinct, never precision. And no person they had ever encountered could have arranged something so elaborate without leaving broken branches, boot prints, or other signs of human presence. Yet the ground around the circle was pristine. Not a single shoe mark. Only faint impressions along the outer edge suggested something light-footed or barefooted had moved through the night. The forest around them felt impossibly still, almost reverent, as if the trees themselves were watching over the grisly display. A low breeze carried the scent of pine and soil, but underneath it lingered a strange, earthy musk Evelyn had never smelled before. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human. It was something older, something wild and purposeful. And as the sisters stood there, staring at the silent ring of arranged bodies, they felt unmistakably that they were not being threatened at random. They were being studied, marked, chosen. The storm rolled in without warning, sweeping down from the ridgeline in a violent rush that made the cabin shudder on its foundation. Rain hammered the tin roof so hard it sounded like stones being thrown from the sky, and lightning carved jagged white scars across the clouds every few seconds. The sisters had weathered Appalachian storms all their lives, but this one felt different from the moment it struck, too sudden, too forceful, too charged with something they couldn't name. The wind moaned through the trees as if 100 voices were calling out at once, and the forest that usually protected them seemed to recoil, leaving their home exposed under the wrath of the mountains. Inside, the lantern swung wildly on its hook, shadows lunging across the walls like living things. Evelyn tried to secure the shutters while Marlene gathered blankets, both of them shouting to be heard over the thunder. But even in the chaos, they felt it, the sensation of being watched, not from the woods this time, but from somewhere dangerously close. The cabin, though small and familiar, suddenly seemed full of corners that held too much darkness. The storm was loud, but beneath its roar came another sound, faint yet distinct, like wood scraping against wood. A hinge shifting. A latch giving. Before they could react, a violent burst of wind slammed into the front door, blowing it open with a force that extinguished the lantern instantly. The world plunged into blackness. Rain poured in across the floorboards. The sisters stumbled toward the doorway, trying to force it shut again, but the storm pushed back with unnatural strength. The pressure felt wrong somehow, as if something stood outside, using the chaos of the wind to mask its intrusion. A deafening crack of thunder shook the cabin, and the sisters were thrown off balance, hitting the floor hard. After that, everything blurred. Marlene remembered the sensation of cold air rushing over her skin, Evelyn remembered what felt like a heavy weight passing by, close enough that she could hear slow, deliberate breathing. Neither could tell how long they remained there, minutes, hours, or something in between. Their consciousness drifted in and out, swallowed by the noise of the storm and an overwhelming sense of disorientation, as if the walls themselves were tilting and the floor was made of shifting earth. When morning finally broke, pale and silent, they woke sprawled across the wooden boards, drenched and trembling with no memory of how the night had ended. The door stood wide open. Muddy prints, wide, bare, unmistakably the same shape they had seen before, trailed from the threshold into the very center of their home. Some prints overlapped, circling the sisters as they lay unconscious, forming a slow, spiraling path that led back into the storm-darkened woods. In the days that followed the storm, the sisters found themselves moving through their home as if it were suddenly unfamiliar terrain, every corner painted with a memory they could not fully grasp. Their bodies felt heavy in strange ways, as though whatever had passed through the cabin that night had left behind a weight that settled inside their bones. Evelyn was the first to notice something was wrong when she rose from her bed and immediately stumbled, her vision dimming at the edges as if a curtain had been drawn over her eyes. She reached for the wall to steady herself, but her hand trembled violently, each finger tingling as though blood had stopped flowing to them. Marlene tried to help her, only to collapse to her knees moments later, overcome by a sudden wave of dizziness so severe she could barely keep her eyes open. It was as if an invisible sickness had seeped into the cabin with the rain and now clung to them like a second skin. At first, they blamed exhaustion. The storm had stolen an entire night from them, leaving only fragments of memory behind, and fear alone could leave the body shaking for days. But as the hours passed, the symptoms only intensified. Evelyn developed sudden, blinding headaches that struck without warning, accompanied by a hollow ringing in her ears that echoed like distant chanting. Marlene experienced sharp chills even when wrapped in quilts, her skin rising in gooseflesh as though touched by unseen fingers. Both women suffered bouts of nausea that came and went unpredictably, leaving them disoriented and unable to keep food down. The cabin, once warm and safe, now felt hostile, its air thick with something unidentifiable yet undeniably present. When they finally gathered enough strength to seek help, they made the slow walk into town, leaning on each other with every step. The doctor examined them with growing bewilderment, unable to attribute their symptoms to any illness he recognized. He asked whether they had been exposed to contaminated water, poisonous plants, or even smoke from a chemical burn, but the sisters could only shake their heads. Nothing in their environment had changed except the night of the storm, yet something from that night had undeniably taken hold of them. The doctor noted their unusually low blood pressure, irregular pulses, and the faint bruising along their arms and shoulders, patterns so symmetrical they seemed impossible to have been caused by the chaos of falling during the storm. When they returned home, the symptoms worsened, as though the very walls intensified whatever force was affecting them. They began to experience fleeting hallucinations, shadows shifting in their peripheral vision, the crackle of twigs snapping inside the house even when no one moved, the unmistakable sensation that someone unseen stood just behind them every time they closed their eyes. The sisters weren't simply sick, they were being haunted by something that had crawled out of the storm and into them. The longer the sisters endured their strange illness, the more undeniable the signs became that something had returned to their cabin, something that had not simply passed through on the night of the storm but had claimed the place as its own. At first, the clues were subtle enough that either woman could have dismissed them as symptoms of exhaustion or hallucinations brought on by fear. But the more they tried to rationalize what they were seeing, the more the evidence mounted, tangible and chilling in its clarity. The first object they found was a rough, hand-carved stick propped neatly against the doorframe. It wasn't shaped like anything familiar, just a long piece of wood sharpened to a point and wrapped near the top with strips of bark twisted together like sinew. The tool looked primitive, almost ritualistic, and neither sister recognized it as something made by any local hunter or passerby. It felt like an offering or a warning left at their threshold. A day later, Evelyn discovered thick, coarse strands of hair caught in the splintered edge of the windowsill. The hair was dark, matted, and far too long to belong to either of them. When she pulled it free, an earthy, musky scent lifted from it, something animalistic yet undeniably human. The hair was tangled with burrs and fine debris that could only come from deep forest ground, The kind of debris left behind by something that crawled or slithered rather than walked upright. The sight of it made her breath hitch, yet she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. She kept staring at the strands, terrified to acknowledge the obvious truth. The creature had been close enough to press its head, or its body, against the window as if listening in. More disturbing was what Marlene found carved into the wooden beam beside her bed. The marks were fresh, not there the day before, a series of scratches arranged in a vertical pattern that mirrored the marks found on the bodies of their goats. The edges of the carvings were ragged, as though made by teeth rather than a blade. When she pressed her fingertips to them, she felt the grooves were warm, as if whatever had made them had done so not long before she woke. The thought that the creature, this feral man the hunters had whispered about, had stood inside her bedroom while she slept, running his teeth or nails along the wood, filled her with a terror so primal she couldn't speak for minutes. And then came the knock. Not outside, but inside the house, at the back of the pantry door where no person should ever be able to stand without the sisters hearing them enter. The sound was faint, soft, unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't a threat but a claim, a reminder that the creature knew their routines, understood their vulnerabilities, and moved through their home with increasing confidence. Every sign he left behind, hair, carvings, tools, even the faint impressions of bare feet on the dirt floor, carried the same message. The feral man was not lurking randomly or attacking blindly. He was marking them, studying them, claiming them as if they belonged to him, body and mind, as though he had chosen them for a purpose neither sister could yet understand but both feared with every breath. The sisters had always believed that if things became dire enough, they could turn to the people of Briar Hollow. The community was small but tight-knit, made up of families who had endured generations of hardship in the mountains. Yet when Evelyn and Marlene finally gathered the courage to ask for help, carrying their carved beams and strange artifacts wrapped in cloth, the reaction they met was nothing like what they expected. The moment they mentioned the prints, the circles of stones, the knocking inside the pantry, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt hostile. No one laughed. No one questioned their sanity. Instead, the townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances, the older ones stiffening like people hearing the return of something they'd prayed never to face again. One of the elders, a woman with white braids and a face carved by decades of hard winters, pulled them aside with trembling hands. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she warned them not to speak of that thing in public. The mountains had long memories, she said, and the more you talked about certain creatures, the more power you gave them. But when the sisters pressed her for answers, the woman lowered her gaze and shook her head, refusing to say more. Others in town weren't even willing to hear the details. The moment the sisters mentioned the gorge or the strange hair found at the window, people turned away with muttered excuses. Their eyes held something deeper than fear, resignation, like they had already accepted a truth the sisters hadn't yet understood. A few men offered practical explanations in voices that sounded hollow even to themselves. Maybe a bear had wandered too close, they suggested, though not one of them would look the sisters in the eye when they said it. Others whispered that the Turners should leave the mountains entirely, but their tone made it clear this wasn't advice, it was a plea. As if the presence stalking the cabin wasn't just dangerous but contagious, capable of spreading misfortune like a curse across anyone foolish enough to get too close. When Marlene mentioned the doctor's confusion about their symptoms, a hush fell over the group. Several women crossed themselves. One man spat on the ground. Another slammed his door shut so abruptly the echo rang down the street. What unsettled the sisters most was how quickly the townsfolk distanced themselves, both physically and emotionally. People who had shared food and tools with them for years now avoided even brushing past their shoulders. The air around Evelyn and Marlene seemed to thicken with a kind of superstitious dread, as though the mark the creature had left on their home had followed them into town and clung to them like an invisible stain. No one offered to walk them back. No one asked if they were safe. The message was clear without being spoken. Whatever had chosen them was older than fear, older than law, and the people of Briar Hollow wanted no part in interfering with it. The sisters returned to their cabin with a heavy sense of abandonment, but what awaited them inside was far worse than isolation. As soon as they stepped through the doorway, an icy draft swept across their skin, carrying with it a scent both earthy and metallic, like damp soil mixed with rusted iron. The cabin looked unchanged at first glance, the same modest furniture, the same worn rugs, the same lantern sitting crooked on the table, but within moments, each sister sensed the difference. It was in the air, thick and humming, as though a presence lingered just out of sight, watching them with a patience that bordered on predatory fascination. The silence inside was so complete it seemed to vibrate, and when Evelyn shut the door behind them, the faint echo sounded unnaturally delayed, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the sound rather than reflecting it. Marlene was the first to notice the objects that hadn't been there before. A crude bundle of twigs hung from the ceiling beam, tied together with braided vines that still dripped sap. The formation wasn't random. The branches had been bent into a shape that resembled a crude humanoid figure, its limbs unnaturally long, its head marked with a symbol roughly carved into the bark. Beneath it lay a pile of dark stones arranged in a spiral pattern, each rock smeared with a reddish-brown substance that neither sister dared to touch. Evelyn's breath caught as she realized the spiral perfectly matched the shape of the footprints found circling them after the storm. The creature wasn't just entering their home, it was marking it with signs whose meanings they couldn't decipher but instinctively feared. Throughout the cabin, more objects waited. A tuft of matted hair hung from the corner of a window frame, woven into a braid that felt disturbingly human. At the foot of their beds lay small wooden figures carved with jagged strokes, each smeared with clay and ashes, each one bearing shallow grooves that resembled teeth marks. The sisters' belongings had been moved ever so slightly, boots turned toward the door, blankets folded in uneven thirds, the lantern wick freshly trimmed by a hand that clearly had no understanding of tools. The intruder hadn't rummaged or stolen. It had touched, examined, familiarized itself with every detail of their lives. But the deepest violation awaited in the far corner of the cabin, where the scent grew strongest. Their pantry door was ajar again, though they had locked it before leaving for town. Inside, the shelves had been rearranged, jars placed upside down, bags of grain torn open not for food but seemingly out of curiosity. A smear of muddy fingerprints trailed along the wooden boards, each print broad and long, the ridges unnaturally deep. At the very back of the pantry, carved into the wall itself, was a new series of marks, long, vertical scratches arranged in paired sets. They looked like the rough outline of ribs. It was no longer a question of whether the creature had entered their home. The question now was how long it had been living there without them realizing it. The moment the sisters realized they could no longer ignore the truth came one evening as the sun dipped behind the ridge, staining the sky blood orange and casting long, twisted shadows across their cabin. For weeks, Evelyn and Marlene had tried to convince themselves that the feral presence was limited to marking, observing, and frightening them into submission, but the signs had grown impossible to dismiss. The strange carvings, the arranged stones, the marks on the animals, the hair, the footprints, none of it had been random. Each action, each detail, pointed toward a purpose they were only beginning to grasp. It was in the way the creature's footprints circled the cabin so carefully, the way its tools were left behind as if to be discovered, and the way the objects in their home had been subtly shifted. Everything was intentional, and it was becoming horrifyingly clear that they were part of a plan that had been set into motion long before the storm even arrived. That night, Evelyn noticed a subtle movement in the corner of the room, faint enough that she thought it might be a trick of the flickering lantern. Then Marlene whispered a warning, pointing to a shadow that stretched along the floor like a living thing. The outline was distorted, elongated, and impossibly fast, moving without sound, circling them before vanishing against the wall. Panic set in, but the terror was compounded by the realization that the creature was no longer content with remaining outside or at the edges of their awareness. It had claimed access to their home, their sanctuary, and it had done so without confrontation, without a struggle. The invisible boundary that had once offered them comfort, the cabin itself, was no longer theirs. As they gathered themselves in the center of the room, shivering and whispering, the final truth began to crystallize. The creature had chosen them, marked them, studied them, and now its designs were nearing completion. The journal they had uncovered in the attic weeks earlier, filled with the accounts of families who had vanished in the gorge under similar circumstances, suddenly made sense. The patterns repeated: storm, intrusion, signs, isolation, and finally, the complete disappearance of those who had lived in fear too long. The creature didn't act out of hunger, nor out of mindless malice, it operated according to a code older than memory, following rituals that had been passed down through generations in the hidden recesses of the mountains. And the sisters were the next chapter. With every sound, the rustling of the wind, the distant snap of a branch, the occasional low echo that reverberated through the walls, they could feel its presence closing in. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge, it was a stage, and they were the unwilling actors in a performance written by something neither human nor entirely beast. Every instinct told them to run, but the truth was unavoidable. Whatever had visited them during the storm, whatever had studied and marked them, had plans they could not escape. They were trapped in a ritual that had begun long before they had set foot in Briar Hollow, and the revelation of its purpose, terrifying, inexorable, and inescapable, would soon confront them fully, leaving nothing of their old lives intact.